Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Occulted. So, in our last episode, we talked about who is behind what I would call assassination culture, which I think we need to look at the Kirk assassination under the same envelope, which is, who is causing these high-profile assassinations, and is there any chance, is there any possibility that assassination can actually be part of a cult rite? So creating a public martyr, creating death in a very public way in front of the masses, spilling blood in front of the masses. Is that really actually associated with occultism, and if so, how and why? That's what we're going to be focusing on for the next few weeks on this episode of Occulted. So in the last episode, I spoke about how it's important to acknowledge the mundane level of analysis and activity in the world, and also the spiritual level. So we can't just stop with, saying, the person who killed Charlie Kirk is a transgender person, or it is a MAGA person, or it is, a lefty person. And we have to understand that there's actually a very small occult group in power that uses politicians, that uses entire countries and their military, that uses even churches, even religion can become infiltrated, as disgusting as that is, that spirituality, the most holy thing we're supposed to have, can absolutely become infiltrated. Just like political offices can be, because we're human and we're not perfect. Right? So you have all of these different institutions that are infiltrated by, I would say, ultimately a very small group of people that have consolidated power. Very small group of people relative to what we think is running the world. Now, that doesn't mean that our institutions are completely powerless. It doesn't mean that we should no longer engage in society. It doesn't mean that we have failed. It just means that we have to wake up to what is actually happening around us so that we can drive society over time in a direction that is more meaningful and healthy for us. But that involves understanding the spiritual level of this, which is that there is a dark occult group, a dark occult order that is at the top of the world, that controls things. Now, this has been a huge part of conspiratorial literature and conspiratorial talk, but really we are the sum total of our beliefs. We really, everybody, whether you admit it or not, or like to say it, everybody is following a certain belief system and has certain ideas. And it doesn't matter whether you believe in the things that I'm going to talk about today or not. It's that it is my opinion, and through my analysis over many years, that I believe that there are very powerful people. Its structure I don't entirely know. I can guess. That's the best I can do. But there are powerful people who have certain occult ideologies and have certain esoteric beliefs and practices that you can see when you're educated on it. So the whole point of the next few weeks is to really focus this level of occult analysis on the Kirk assassination and the Kirk shooting, because it is my opinion that the Kirk assassination is very similar to other assassinations that have happened in the past. You know, where there's an assassination that happens and then suddenly the world starts to fall into more intense turmoil and wars on the table. And it just seems to be like assassination and death would be a very important rite to, say, a death cult, to say a cult of, let's say, the Black Sun, let's say a cult of Saturn, let's say a cult of darkness. When you have a kind of spiritual group, a kind of dark brotherhood that literally worships death rather than life, this would be very similar to traditional what we think of Satanism, which is sort of actually more like inversionism. It's against nature. And as I mentioned last time, it funnels itself often into advanced technology because it does not know Christ. It does not know life. It does not know truth. It does not know the way, right? It has to then gain power in something external, in something outside of the self, because within us all is the Christ, which gives us our life, which gives us our ability to become eternal. So now they want to create the technologies that make them eternal, the technologies that make them spiritual visionaries, like, you know, we're going to get the brain chip and we're going to, you know, do all of these incredible feats like time travel and, you know, like go disappear in the spaceship and go into one plane or another. It's like they're trying to sell you what is done through the immortal body, through the eternal self, that you can do that with a machine now. You can do that with the UFO technology. You can do that with the Neuralink. You can do that through technology, which is our modern brand of Satanism, which a lot of people don't understand, that there's a huge dark and satanic element to technology. And I'm not saying this to be sensational. I'm saying this literally. In the anthroposophical system, the harmonic forces are associated with technology, which I've talked about this a lot in this series. So this is something that we need to understand, we need to get onto, because as I mentioned in the last episode, we don't see these dark magicians, these dark brotherhoods operating in like the way that they would have in the John Dee era, or in this, they have all these grimoires and they're using herbs and crystals. The crystals are in the devices. They're using electricity, they're using magnetism, they're using nuclear energy, they're using the nuclear transformation that goes on. This is the new stage of occultism, and we are not prepared for it because we don't understand spiritual science, which is the actual objective scientific view of the spiritual world. We know that angels exist. That's mentioned in the Bible. It's mentioned in basically every spiritual text, whether it be called an angel or a deva. Okay, we understand that these things exist, but we don't know the science of them. Well, there are people in the dark arts that absolutely do. And so we are very behind on this, which is the purpose of this series. So let's begin with our discussion today, which is on the Kirk assassination, and that what makes me suspicious that this assassination could be a ritual, besides the fact that if there is a organized satanic brotherhood, an organized satanic group, okay, and I'm using satanic as a shorthand here. There are other words that we could use, but a broader audience wouldn't understand that. So if there is an organized satanic group, they would absolutely find it useful that the Kirk assassination was in between two eclipses, a lunar eclipse and a solar eclipse. And I want to mention one more thing about people who are coming forward and saying that they think that the Kirk assassination was fake and that there was a squib underneath Charlie's neck. Now, I don't know. I can't say for sure. I'm watching the video and I'm horrified like everybody else. We're all watching that and we're all horrified. I don't know what happened behind the scenes. I can't know for sure. But what I can add to the conversation that everything is fake, that the death is fake, is from the occult angle. Death has value. So if this is an occult rite, if that was a public assassination, that was actually a kind of dark occultism to gain power, then people have to understand that death is part of that the spilling of the blood and seeing the blood is part of that. So there is no occult value if it is fake. So if it's like a squib and there's, blood coming out, and like Charlie Kirk's in a witness protection program or something, which seems to be very far-fetched to me, but I'm open to whatever. That doesn't have the ceremonial value, the magical value of when blood is actually shed and when death happens and an actual portal to the spiritual world opens when somebody dies. That portal can be used and hijacked as a ceremonial rite. So when the veil thins, through death, or as we're going to see through eclipses, especially two eclipses, this is a time of death. This is a time of a very thin veil. So from a materialist level of analysis, it's very easy to get caught up in all of these different theories. Is there a squib? What about this? What about that? And that's fine. All these discussions are natural and normal and they should happen. But when you begin to bring in the occult level of analysis, the spiritual level of analysis, then that starts to anchor these conversations in a different way. We start to have to factor in, could this very public death actually be a kind of death magic, a kind of occult rite by a dark occult group? Because if you're not including the occult, then you're assuming that this group doesn't exist and you're perpetuating it. So in a lot of ways, the idea that this is all theater and it's a squib, that is taking away the occult, the potential occult reality of this. In that death, if there is this shadowy group, or there is some kind of Q level conspiracy, that doesn't really help the dark occult, because the dark occult want death. They want that to happen. They want people to be traumatized by an actual death, and they want the blood to spill. That is how they operate, unfortunately. Okay, so when we add that occult level of analysis, we start to see that, well, death is actually valuable to people who are in a death cult. So there's no reason for them to fake that if this actually is an occultist, which I would assume. And the first hint that I have of this, and why that would be my conclusion, is that the assassination takes place in a extremely ceremonial time, and a very rare time celestially, which is in between two eclipses. So let's take a look at that. Okay. So here we have a layout of the Kirk assassination. Now, right before the Kirk assassination, we have a lunar eclipse, which is a full lunar eclipse or blood moon on September 7th. Then we have the Kirk assassination, which takes place on September 10th. And then we have a partial solar eclipse on September 21st. And then you have the solstice leading into the dark days. So you have this highly charged period where there are two eclipses. And in between those two eclipses, we get the public and brutal and humiliating assassination of an extremely powerful and important, whether you agree with his politics or not, he was important, public figure. This is a very big deal on the occult side. And actually, if I were to say where, if you were a malevolent occultist, if you were, and someone were to say, where would you want to plan something like this? That's exactly what I would say. I would say I'd want it near an eclipse. The more eclipses, the better. And I'd want it literally going into the darkest days of the year, so I could get as much obstruction and chaos as possible as we near the darkest times in the year. It is textbook. It is a recipe. It is completely what you would expect. There's actually nothing complex about that on the occult level, as you're going to see. So what is a celestial event? Why do we care about an eclipse, a solstice, an equinox, these different planetary alignments? So how you have to view it is that the cosmos is like a body that we live within. So we have our body, which has these different organs which perform different functions, and we live within what would be considered the body of God, or the great man, or the body of the angels. And the planetary spheres are like the organs of the body of God. And each planetary sphere has a different quality that it imparts on the earth and on humanity. This is the heart of astrology. And originally, and for the longest period of time, astrology, which is the human connection to the cosmos, and astronomy were one, and they still should be one. Because if we actually understood what was happening astrologically, we would be solving this case a lot earlier. I can tell you that. Because nobody is talking deeply enough about the occultism around this. So we have to understand that every single planetary sphere, and now in this case we're dealing with eclipses, so we're dealing with sun, we're dealing with moon, and we're dealing with earth. These are the forces we're dealing with, but there are other great spheres in the cosmos that form the body of the angels, which we live within, or the body of God, which we live within. Now, just like our organs perform a function, every planet, when it has alignments with the earth, is imparting certain forces on the earth. Certain kinds of cosmic rays or changes will happen upon the earth, right? And so how it doesn't affect like it's not like there's a physical ray that's coming from the planet Venus and hitting you and it's causing changes, or it's not like the physical forces of the moon. There's magnets and there's things like that, but it is the fact that we are not just a physical body, we have spiritual bodies. We have actually, there's different ways to identify them, but we kind of have four main bodies. We have a physical body, we have an etheric body, we have an astral body, and then within the astral body, we have like our true core self that is united with Christ, which is the I, which is our true inner core, right? And so it is our spiritual bodies that are actually directly connected to the essence of the stars and the spheres. And so by the time we are on the earth, our spiritual bodies are basically moving and operating exactly how the sky is. So what happens in the sky happens inside of us. What happens inside of us gets distributed into the sky, into the realm of the angels. We are in constant communion with the angelic hierarchies, which again are the spiritual beings behind the cosmos. Again, not aliens. These are the angelic hierarchies or the spiritual hierarchies. And then you have the spheres, which represent the different kind of choirs of angels, the different characteristics of the angels. So the cosmos is one giant body we operate within, and the spheres and the stars are sort of like the organs of the body that affect us. And they're not affecting us materially, they're affecting us on the level of thought, on the level of feeling. It's why sometimes, God, you wake up and it's like, oh, you're exhausted and you're so tired and you've slept for 8 hours, but you're so tired. And then it's because for you personally, or even collectively, an event like an eclipse season, you've got a lot of oppositions, you've got a lot of planetary alignments going on that are draining you. And this is why presidents and very important people often to this day have an astrologer. They won't necessarily like tell you about it, but they do use psychics and astrologers. And they have for thousands of years. Every king has had an astrologer or a mystic that has been advising on when to go to war. You know, one of the main things that the Oracle at Delphi did was advise on war and political strategy based on spiritual events and spiritual beings, which ultimately control and manifest in our material life here. We are in this bizarre period of time that's unique to humanity where we don't do that now. And it's causing us to become more and more lost in our understanding of ourselves and our understanding of the world, because we don't have this paradigm that acknowledges the spiritual world and a huge portion of our own consciousness that's spiritual, our angel, you know. So let's get into the specific effect of an eclipse. Okay. So generally, what's happening with an eclipse is that you're dealing with shadow. So you literally have a lunar eclipse, which the shadow of the earth is cast onto the moon, usually in kind of this really ominous, eerie, you know, red glow, called a blood moon, I believe. And then you have a solar eclipse, which is when the moon comes between the sun and the earth, and it casts like a sort of very intense dark shadow on certain portions of the earth. So the whole earth doesn't go dark in a solar eclipse. It just kind of carves like a snake its way across certain portions of the earth. So the eclipses, therefore, are all about shadow. They're about darkness. They're about the individual's inner shadow coming forward, rearing its ugly head. And also, it's about the collective shadow. It's about human beings as a collective and our wounds and our trauma. But it's also objectively a time where the entities within the shadow realms, which is within the underworld, which is within the demonic plane, the eighth sphere, these entities also can much more easily roam the earth. They can affect humanity, and they have power during an eclipse. So eclipses are a darker time. They are a chaotic time, and they would classically be called a malefic time. If you're using, astrological terms or classical esoteric terms, it'd be malefic. So eclipses also, open and close. It's like a gate that's opening and closing, essentially. And the veil is incredibly thin during the time of an eclipse. And the veil is, you could say, a spiritual term to describe the level of permeability between the spiritual plane and the human plane. There are times where the natural world and supernatural world are seemingly very far apart. And then there are times with different celestial alignments where the veil becomes very thin, and eclipses are one of those events. So let's start with a lunar eclipse. There we go. So a lunar eclipse is when the Earth comes between the sun and the moon. And so the Earth's shadow is cast upon the moon. And this is what we experienced on the 7th, was this blood moon full lunar eclipse. So this is what we were going through right before the Kirk assassination. So during a lunar eclipse, all of our inner wounding comes forward. So whatever trauma you're holding, whatever pain, that begins to be pulled forward in your consciousness during a lunar eclipse, especially. So this is a really good time to do inner work. It's a good time to, I would say, not have a lot of plans, not have a lot of expectations, and just get still and listen to what is coming up. And a lot of the times, what comes forward first is sort of difficult feelings, difficult emotions. You may feel anger, you may feel depression, you may feel this weird anxiety. It's these emotions that are stored within our body and within our being that we kind of shove down in order to operate in the world. Well, during the eclipse, that stuff starts to become louder and louder and louder. So lunar eclipses especially are very inward, they're very personal, they're very introspective, and it's a time to rest. It's a time to listen, typically. Now, people will also experience heightened levels of feeling as though they're going mad. We often hear these accounts from different nurses at the hospital, or individuals that say, paramedics and stuff like that say, oh, well, we it's those full moons. The full moons are this crazy time when all of the crime spikes and people hurt themselves. And it's like, the full moon it's a wild time, and that's always been part of folklore. And this is why, is because people's darkness is kind of coming to the forefront. And if you don't have a regular practice where you're working through, and healing yourself and, getting therapy or working through whatever it is, then these eclipses can be very painful for you, because it's coming forward and it's just feelings. People will also get memories coming forward from childhood, or like they'll start remembering things they thought they've forgotten, because that's what the eclipses are all about. And people will have bad dreams also during the eclipses. They feel like they're being psychically attacked or spiritually attacked because, yes, the portals into the lower planes have opened and people do experience spiritual attacks more so as well. Okay, so that is the lunar eclipse when the Earth's shadow was cast upon the moon, and that was September 7th, and it was a full lunar eclipse. So a few days before the Kirk assassination, people are experiencing a full lunar eclipse, and they're more irritated, they're more prone to depression, they've got a lot of wounds coming forward, right? Then we have the Kirk assassination a few days later, and then about a week or so after that, week and a half after that, we then experience a solar eclipse. So we've got the lunar eclipse, the Kirk assassination, and then the solar eclipse. Now, the solar eclipse is when the moon's shadow is cast upon the Earth in a very distinct snake-like line. Because as it's happening, the Earth is moving, so the shadow forms what looks like a snake. Okay, so during the solar eclipse, it's a little bit different than a lunar eclipse, but they're both dealing with lunar energy and Earth energy. They're both dealing with sun, moon, Earth. Whether it's a lunar eclipse or a solar eclipse, they're still dealing with the same planets. So there's always going to be this undercurrent of the relationship between our relationship between sun and moon, or light and darkness. You know, eclipses are about a relationship with light and dark, right? Which is also why you could see immediately after the Kirk assassination, it immediately started to divide and consolidate into political warfare and just this back and forth, because that's exactly what these things, that's exactly the climate spiritually, mentally, emotionally that people were in. So during a solar eclipse, God's objective will is being blocked by lunar forces. So the sun in occultism is the Christ being. It is the symbol of the Christ being. You can look through, the different centuries of Christianity, and Christ is often portrayed as the sun, being united with the sun. And in esoteric Christianity, there is a deep union between, obviously, God the Father and the Son, and the Son, the S-U-N, and the Son, S-O-N, and S-U-N. They're all united and work through the nourishing and catalyzing rays of the sun. I mean, if we didn't have the sun, we would literally just not exist. And that's the same thing with God. So the sun is an image of the Christ, and it is an image of God's will being laid upon man. And in order for humanity to really, truly evolve, we have to integrate and align and attune ourselves to God's will, to the spirits in the sun, if you will. If it was earlier pre-Christ, it would be the spirits of the sun and the sun. And we were very much connecting with the Christ through a nature perspective, but we were still interacting with the Christ only in the way that we could understand it at the time, which was not as a person yet. So during this time where the moon comes between the sun and the earth, the moon is casting the shadow. How that's viewed in occultism is that during that time period, God's will and God's effect on humanity is literally obscured momentarily by the forces of the moon. Now, the forces of the moon are complex. The moon isn't evil, the moon isn't bad. But the moon is, you could say, the entity that keeps darkness and shadow and demonic entities at bay. So the moon represents humanity's unhealed past, And the moon represents, therefore, a lot of backwards and demonic entities that appear through the gate of the moon. So it's sort of like the lunar realm, though it's not objectively evil, it is the realm from which the evil emerges in the world. It is the realm that, it is the gate that blocks and keeps the underworld at bay, right? So when you have a solar eclipse, you have this period in occultism where God's will is obstructed, and for that moment of time, darkness has its way with the earth. And so certain things are possible during a solar eclipse that would be very difficult to manifest on the earth, not in a solar eclipse. So it's sort of like during a solar eclipse, evil can reign much more easily. You have these sort of dark entities that can appear in the hearts of humanity. And we saw a lot of people really becoming extremely paranoid or going into these really incredibly dark headspaces. And that is all part of the very negative aspects of an eclipse, especially if there is a high level of ceremonial dark magic going on that's going to augment all of these things. So when God's will is obstructed by the lunar forces, or when darkness obstructs the light, spiritual beings outside of God's order, outside of the order of the Father, can reign in a way that they would not normally be able to, and they have a greater impact. Now, how darkness operates is there's not really people think that dark occultism is all about precision, and in a way it is, but dark occultism's main thrust, the main mechanism in which it works, is actually through chaos. So dark occultism does not actually gain its power through order. Order is the Father. Order is the Sun. It is the white sun force. And chaos is the black sun force. It is the death force. And so how they operate is basically by creating chaos on the earth. And then through chaos, they try to redirect and create their version of order, which is never the order of the Father. It's never the objective order of God. It's always an order around them as gods. So there is the creation of chaos, often through death, public death, or whatever means they can. War is another great one for the death cult, obviously. They want to create as much chaos as possible so people aren't thinking properly. They lower their standards, and then they really kind of present themselves as gods. So it's not ever really about God, even when they say it is. They'll say anything that they need to just get you to worship them. But they create the chaos, lower your standards, make you live in fear, and then remove more and more rights, remove as many rights as they possibly can. And then they instill themselves as gods. And in our era, that will be done through the use of technology. It'll be done through a technological revolution. It'll be done through the idea that we have this miraculous technology, this free energy technology that will bring us into this new level. These incredible surveillance that we need, the Golden Dome, the AI, all of that kind of stuff will be how they present themselves as gods. And again, I'm not against advanced technology. I'm against certain people coming forward with advanced technology and being degenerates. I'm against degenerate people who ultimately have bizarre religions that operate around themselves that think that technology can perform spiritual feats when it cannot. And technology should not replace our relationship with Christ. Technology should not be replacing anything spiritual, which is exactly how technology is being rolled out as it is. So there is nothing wrong with enjoying AI or having even advanced whatever kind of technology. The issue is not that we are at this point of advancement. That's fine. The issue is the people that introduce it ultimately are placing themselves as gods, and they are ritually creating the technologies. And they are introducing it in a way where the technologies are spiritual. They connect with why. This is the same thing I mentioned last time, where it's like the moment people start talking about UFOs, right? This is Anna Polina Luna and that whole UFO Congress stuff. It's the UFOs, the advanced technology, and then they just take over the idea of angels and spirituality with technology. This is coming. It's like with this, why is it that we have a dual eclipse, a mass public martyrdom and assassination where blood is spilled, and then now suddenly we're getting these mysterious drones over Europe where nobody knows what they are, but they have to completely take up the news space again. Yes, because they tried the drone operation last year over New Jersey and they didn't have a favorable result. So now they're going to try to do it this year. And they'll unite it with nuclear, and they will try to bring forward the interdimensional argument, the Mars stuff. Watch Mars Mysteries. I've already gone through that. And it's going to be a whole thing that is spiritual, religious, anti-Christ. And by anti-Christ, I mean any kind of healthy spirituality, right? Whether you're Christian or not, this kind of spirituality is the spirituality of death, pure death. So this is what we're looking at. We get the chaos, we get the trauma, we get all of this dark stuff going on so that we can lower our standards, beg for all of this technology, and they come in with the answer to the human origin story. Oh, I found all these biblical texts that were hidden. This is the truth about Jesus, or this is the truth about God. You've been reading your Bibles wrong for all these years. It's aliens, or whatever the heck else. I've already gone into this, but we really need to be careful because this is their religion. This is their kind of occultism. Okay? So during the solar eclipse, again, the eclipse season is the perfect time for dark occultists to do something like this. It allows them to hit humanity with something incredibly traumatic at their spiritually lowest point. It allows them to use that public death and the spilling of the blood and the trauma to quite literally feed dark entities on the earth, to give them more power over the material plane than normal, to create more fog, more confusion, more fear, more paranoia. And everybody's anger and everybody's fear and everybody's stuff that's already coming up is augmented and feeding the dark entities that were opened through the portal of a very public death. And then we see, of course, all of these shootings happen afterwards. Well, that also feeds dark entities for a death cult that want to open up the lower planes. War feeds dark entities. Death, public death and assassinations like that are rituals for the dark occult. It's not for people who operate in the light. For people who operate in the light and with Christ, it is love, it is life, it is truth. And the power comes from inner transformation and union with the Christ, period. That's it. That's how we evolve. That's how we become immortal and eternal in his image. But this is a whole other thing. It's a whole other culture that we have been dealing with on this planet for thousands of years. And they deal in assassination. They deal in war. They deal in chaos. The entities that they feed, the egregores they use, they feed with fear, paranoia, low emotion, anger. All of that stuff feeds the dark side, which is why Stoicism is such an important thing to practice and keep in mind, because it's through Stoicism that we become objective, conscious observers to what's going on inside of us and inside the world. And we break the patterns of just operating, through reactivity. If you're reacting, you're not powerful. If you're getting caught up and swept up you're in the algorithm and whatever else, you're not powerful. You have to set your inner algorithm. You have to use your mind. You have to operate according to your heart, your soul. That leads you, not what the crowd is doing. The reality that we become so addicted to social media feeds all of this even more. We're getting funneled into more and more states of mania and conspiracies and paranoia that is not rooted in anything. So that's also part of this. So eclipses, a simple way to remember it is that eclipses cause shadows. Whether it's a lunar eclipse and the Earth's shadow is being cast on the moon, creating that kind of red glow, or whether it's a solar eclipse and the moon's shadow is being cast on the Earth like a snake. As the Earth moves, the shadow does that. It's all about shadows, either the moon's shadow or the Earth's shadow. So eclipses are all about shadow. It's about humanity facing their own personal inner shadows. And anytime there's say, a demonic attachment, demonic possession, dark entities that start to get a hold of people or walk amongst the world, there are laws to that. So you can't just randomly have a demonic attachment. There has to be something within you that is unhealed, that has not yet been brought to God and laid at his feet. You have not yet renounced a part of yourself to God, and you're suffering in some way. And it is where we suffer, it is where we are damaged, and everybody is. There's nobody walking around out here like, well, I'm perfect. I don't have anything. We all have something, okay? But it is where we are wounded, and it is where we do not yet know God in our heart. That is where demonic entities attach. They attach in our darkest moments and in the parts of ourselves that we hide, the parts of ourselves that are traumatized. And this is why you can have somebody go to, say, an event and actually start to experience some kind of low mood. They could get an attachment or something, and someone else that went to the same event thought it was great. It's because everybody interacts with the spiritual world, dark and light, according to their inner conditions, according to who you are inside. This is why having a meditation practice, having a relationship with God, this is why going to therapy if you need that, having a journaling practice, all that is so important, because over time you can become pretty impervious, or at least not so susceptible to these things. The most susceptible people are those that refuse to do this, refuse to do inner work. They're not conscious. They're not self-aware. The people who are not self-aware, who never examine themselves, are the most susceptible to demonic possession. So it's not like when we're talking about this, and I want this to be crystal clear, it's not like, oh, the eclipse is happening, like batten the hatches, close the gates because the Walking Dead or they're coming out and they're gonna get you. No, I mean, you have to have something for them to get. You have to have something in you that is like them, something that is unhealed, something that is dark. And it doesn't even mean that you're a bad person. It means there's something within you that is unhealed. And again, we all have that. So dark entities attach because there's something within you that is unhealed, that is in darkness. And in a way, this is why eclipses, this is why even demonic entities, they can actually be helpful objectively, because what they do is they augment the part of you that's unhealed, and they begin to show it to you more and more and more and more by feeding on you in that one place. They make that part of your personality become more and more dominant, so you face it. But for some people who refuse to become self-aware, refuse to individuate, refuse to become responsible for their thoughts, their feelings, and their will, those people become taken over oftentimes by a demonic entity because they got an attachment, and instead of learning and going inward and understanding, why do I feel this way, they hid and they hid and they hid and they hid. They avoided self-realization, and now there's very little of their essence that's actually there. And there's a demonic entity that works through them. This is called possession, classically. It's very difficult to actually fully become possessed or have, that kind of thing going on when you're a self-realized and healing person. We don't really live in that chaotic of an environment. We do have the ability to create and construct a life where we can deal with this stuff. But if we don't understand it at all, you don't know what an entity is, you don't know what eclipse is, then we really are in trouble. So I also just did a couple weeks ago a class on spiritual development. It's called Psychic Business, but anybody can take it and enjoy it. You don't have to be a working mystic or anything like that. Only the last portion of it is about that. The first portion is actually about creating a strong routine for spiritual development, and then about how to renunciate and attune yourself to God so that you're protected from these things, which is in that class because it's very important in spiritual work, in spiritual service, that you have that down. So if you want more information on that, or you're interested on that, that was taught. I taught that a few weeks ago. It's called Psychic Business Development. And the first few hours are all just about attunement and this kind of stuff. So if you're interested in that, check that out. So there are two kinds of eclipses, as I mentioned, the solar and a lunar eclipse. And the lunar eclipse is more associated with people's personal inner shadow, their personal relationship with the moon. And if you're an astrologer, you'll completely understand where the moon is in your natal chart or someone's natal chart, and then any oppositions during an eclipse, any transits during an eclipse, is going to make that moon come alive. So you can actually get information by going to an astrologer, consulting with an astrologer that's going to let you know what transits are going on and what you can expect as well. And I'm not an astrologer, but I do have a great amount of respect for astrology. So just want to mention that. A solar eclipse is a little bit different. You're still going to be dealing during a solar eclipse with darkness. You're still going to deal with shadow, all eclipses you are. But a solar eclipse is more associated in ceremonial magic and the dark arts, with this high time where darkness can roam the earth and become more dominant because the sun is temporarily blocked, which means God's will and God's order can be obscured. And I want to also mention that, it's not just the moment of the eclipse, which is often a short period of time. It's actually like often 2 weeks afterwards. And even leading up to the eclipse, it can begin. So you're looking not just at a day, you're looking often at least a fortnight of effects magically, just to be clear. So during eclipses, dark entities find it easier to manifest themselves on Earth, and dark magicians can command them, right? As we'll get into the next portion of this talk today. And the Kirk assassination is an unusual event, as it happened in between a full lunar eclipse on September 7th and a partial lunar eclipse on September 21st. That's a highly charged and rare occult time. And then after the 21st, you have the equinox kicking off the dark days of the year. So the fall equinox, which is September 22nd, is the time in which the day is equal to the night. So after that time period, the night starts to grow and the days become shorter and shorter and shorter and darker and darker and darker. Now, this is a time where artists sometimes love this period. It's very creative, it's very inward, but it's also a time where if there are dark occultists that want to assert power and dominance in the world, and they're using celestial timing, that is when they're going to do all of their crazy stuff from, the equinox to around Epiphany, which is January 6th. That's when, and January 6th, yes, that is another occult reference. That is an occult event as well. It directly is falling on Epiphany. So a lot of, again, my argument is that there's a group in power that is operating through the dark occult. And I think that there's many examples of this, but I think the Kirk assassination is a very good example. But you can even look at January 6th too. Why did that happen on Epiphany? Right? Why? So the combination of, and I actually want to let you know that I will, in our next episode of Occulted next week, I will get into the exact kind of rituals that I believe could have been at play. I'm going to mention 2 with the Kirk assassination. And we're also going to get into more details about the dark occult order, the order of death, and the dark days of the year. So we're really just getting started. We're just scratching the surface today of where we're going to go with this. So the combination of these celestial events, again, is a very, very big deal. It's a very big deal for ceremonial magicians. Okay, for the average person, no. The average person is like picking up their kid from the car park. They're worried about lunch. They're worried about the economy, and we're all in our mundane lives. But we have to understand that the elite, the people who have consolidated all this wealth and power, which again is probably a group of people less than 100, probably a lot less than 100 really, they're not worried about those things. They're operating on a multi-dimensional level, meaning they have spiritual, ceremonial, magical events and practices that affect people's subconscious minds, right? That's why the internet goes crazy with the revelation of the method stuff or predictive programming stuff, right? Because we're just waking up to understand that that is a legitimate form of occultism. And then they operate on the world stage. They have this occult level in which they use celestial events like a magician would, because they understand that that's the humanity's spiritual and subconscious level of existence. That's what they're affecting, and it works. And then they have the global physical level. They have the economy that they play with. They have the fact that they've infiltrated different countries through blackmail. And now they have this big technological revolution that they have to bring about that removes all of our rights for the last and final time and introduces Antichrist through technology and everything that we've been talking about here on this channel for literally the last 5 years. So the Kirk assassination is a combination of important celestial events that would absolutely be like a kid in a candy store to somebody who is in the order of death or a dark occultist, okay? You see 2 eclipses like this, close to the equinox leading into the dark days. Oh, I mean, come on, this is their Christmas. Of course they're going to do something like that if, I reserve the right to, move with the flow of things, but come on. Okay, so let's get into eclipse magic, or the kind of ceremonial magic that could be done on an eclipse, or even let's get into the good things that can be done during an eclipse. I wouldn't even call it like magic or rituals or anything, but just sort of activities that you can do to use an eclipse in a positive, conscious way. And then I'm going to get into the evil use of eclipses, or how a dark order could kind of use an eclipse to assert dominance in the world and things like that. So the good use of an eclipse is to, classically, like if you were to go back and say, well, how did the ancients deal with an eclipse? Well, they were terrified of them. First of all, a lot of the earlier cultures were not looking forward to an eclipse. They viewed it as a time of backwardsness, a time of inversion, a time where evil could walk the earth and affect it. And now, from a materialist perspective, we think like, oh, our stupid ancestors, like so superstitious. But actually, they really understood spiritually what was going on because they were still clairvoyant. And our ancestors still had this deep spiritual connection that we are kind of losing through our materialism. But in earlier periods, our ancestors were very clairvoyant. They could sense the spiritual world much more than we could sense it now, actually. So how they were behaving is actually kind of probably how we should behave, which is that they would have these different times of fasting. So if an eclipse was coming, and this would have been like, they still do this, I believe, in India and in the East. They will fast during an eclipse, and they will focus on purification. They would be very superstitious as well about like the foods they were eating. They wouldn't eat a whole lot of food because they believed that during an eclipse that matter would become infested with dark entities. And so they didn't want to eat food because they believed the food was often tainted. And so during an eclipse, people would often fast. They would go into ceremonial baths. They would do very cleansing baths, or they would just say prayers. If you were in a monastery that acknowledged this, you would just pray the whole time. If you were in an ashram, you would just say mantras over and over and over again to build up powerful spiritual energy to balance out the negative forces that would be coming in through the gate of the eclipse. And you would avoid negative thoughts. So as soon as eclipse season comes, you've got to know there's going to be this bend towards negativity, and you don't want to spend too much time thinking about dark stuff because it's going to be much easier for you to do a downward spiral into anxiety or into depression during an eclipse. And so people would try to do fun things. They would have little parties sometimes, little festivals, burn big bonfires to bring the light back. And they would do all these little things to keep them focused on God and to focus on purification, which is exactly what you would do during the eclipse season. And, you would prepare to look at your shadow self. You would actually say, okay, we're coming into this time and I'm actually going to slow down. I'm going to journal and I'm going to confront my childhood trauma as it comes up or whatever comes forward. That's how you deal with an eclipse. That's how you use the good magic. Good magic is self-responsibility. It's self-realization. It is bringing God to your darkness. That's how you use it in a positive way. And actually, good initiates, so people who work in the light, they would not do any kind of like ceremonial event classically during an eclipse. They wouldn't do any kind of initiation rite during an eclipse. That was a big no. Because eclipses were viewed as a time of chaos. You couldn't predict the results. You couldn't wield energy very well as an initiate. So you wouldn't plan on doing any kind of ceremonial practice. You wouldn't plan on doing any kind of initiation. If you were in a mystery school or something, you wouldn't do that. You wouldn't do anything during an eclipse but rest and do inner work. So most occultists won't even try to do anything during an eclipse because it's very difficult to get a certain kind of result. The only kind of real activity, during an eclipse that would be like aggressive would be just to create chaos and amplify the chaos that's already coming through the reality that it is an eclipse. So you would do something to amplify chaos in the world, amplify the darkness in the world, keep the portals open longer than they should be. That's the kind of stuff that is like demonic activity. Like, why would you want to keep the gates open to the dark side for any longer than need be, unless you wanted to destabilize society, right? So there is forms of occultism, which we'll get into in the next episode, that you can do during an eclipse, but it would all be considered black magic, because the good portion of the good spiritual behavior is all about purification, inner work, self-realization, responsibility, building up God within the self. And you can come out of an eclipse and you can be stronger and more powerful and embodied than ever because you used the forces of chaos positively. You were able to observe, you were able to grow through them, right? So, one of the things that I found interesting about eclipses was that the Navajo First Nations they'd walk around or they'd sit and they would just look down at the earth. They wouldn't look at the eclipse, they wouldn't look at the sky, they wouldn't raise their head. And that was out of respect. Because it's not like they feared darkness, but they just had a respect for it. And so a lot of early traditions, they would not look at an eclipse because they found that to be an aggressive act. And so it was just a time where they would only look, they would make themselves they would humble themselves. And they would see also, and this is what even like early Christians would think about eclipses as well, is like they saw it as a time in which the dark and the light were battling. So the angels and the fallen angels were battling it out in the heavens. And so you just kind of remove yourself from that because those are incredible battles that humanity are overwhelmed by. So they also saw it as a time where there was a direct clash between angels and demons in heaven and within humanity. And interestingly enough, pregnant women also had all these different folk customs to prevent their baby from becoming deformed. So they believed that if you had any kind of predisposition to having a baby that would be sick or deformed, that you had to place an amulet on you or a certain kind of metal or a symbol that would absorb the negative effects of the eclipse so it wouldn't get to your baby, because babies were very connected with the moon and the lunar realm and the womb. And so they would protect, they're very superstitious, and they would protect their babies by using certain amulets and metals and herbs and things like that so that the eclipse's forces would not cause harm to their baby. A lot of cultures also would stay indoors, and they wouldn't expose themselves to the unnatural light or the distorted astral light, which they felt was contaminated from the eclipse. So you wouldn't want to be like out, you would want to be covered up indoors, and you wouldn't want to like experience the shadow of the eclipse, because that had malefic entities in it that could make you go crazy or cause harm for your family. Listen, eclipses were not viewed as good times. Doesn't matter, what culture, these were viewed as malefic periods. These were viewed as periods where, people were susceptible to very dark things from the lower astral plane. And there were all kinds of interesting rituals and practices that people did to protect themselves from them, but also go inward and get the most out of it. Some cultures would also create like incredible noise and activity, and they would bang things, and they would, during the eclipse, they would almost create their own kind of positive chaos to confuse the spirits. And get these dark entities away from them. And so that's really interesting as well. They had there's all these different, it's actually interesting to research if you want to look into like the folklore or folk magic around eclipses. Nowadays, we don't even think that it's anything. Like, we don't think that eclipses have any effect on our consciousness. So this is not how we, classically thought, though. All right, let's get into the evil use of eclipses, or the potential dark arts that can be applied to an eclipse. So if you're a dark magician and you're looking out at the calendar of the year, and you want to do some kind of black magic ritual that releases dark entities, that's like necromancing, that's bringing forward fallen angels and things like that, you're going to choose an eclipse. And what you're going to do is you're going to use that eclipse to kind of create a destabilization and a reset. So this is what chaos magicians do. They can't actually objectively introduce a higher order of development, because they don't really believe that there's any God greater than themselves. The common thing for every single black magician is that if you look at their cosmology, even if they understand the spiritual hierarchies and angels and demons and like the elements and everything like that, ultimately their entire cosmology is centered around themselves and their ability to manifest power, their ability to control other people. That gives them value. That gives them a sense of worth, of power. These are incredibly hollow and empty people, right? So they're getting their validation, all of what they should be getting from God, from humanity. They're parasitic. They're parasites. All dark occultists and dark magicians are parasitic because they create chaos that disarms people, and then they try to reset the world or reset life around themselves as more and more powerful, consolidating more power, consolidating more wealth, getting more control, which makes them feel better about themselves. So a dark occultist operates completely differently than a normal person for the most part. There's dark people that are normal, but a dark occultist often is, for the most part, when you're getting into really high level stuff, they're probably completely and totally possessed at that point. There probably isn't much of that person's actual soul in their body. So when you get to these dark occult orders that do have all this power, that have consolidated all this wealth, you're really looking at somebody who's probably completely possessed. And they're just doing the bidding of the demonic plane at that point as a vessel. You know, to contrast that, somebody who is in the light, who is working through Christ, they fully become who they are. You fully become who you are through your inner realization and that Christ is within you as the orienting essence and being in that process. So it's literally, it is kind of like a zombie. We are not looking at the same kind of spiritual organization between somebody who is working through Christ and somebody who is working through Antichrist. They're not even the same kind of human ultimately, which is why as the earth grows and evolves, we will end up seeing a very unnatural kind of human forming over thousands of years through genetic modification and technology, because they are already spiritually so misattuned and attuned to death and attuned to chaos and attuned to darkness that eventually their physical form will develop that physiogeny. Mainly also through their obsession with eugenics and their obsession with, you know, having to use technology for every spiritually inspirational and relevant thing. That's going to create over time a different kind of human body because their attunement is to death. So this is really what we're looking at. When you start plugging into the demonic like that, you're not operating like a normal person. Now, the weird thing is that demonic entities can have an incredible level of intelligence. So they're not dumb, they're not stupid. They're incredibly intelligent. So they're deteriorated, they're degenerate, but they're not stupid. They have a very, very, very high level of intelligence, especially in our period, scientific knowledge. Now, this is covered in the anthroposophical system through the study of Ahriman and a specific kind of demonic class, which is associated with scientism, materialism, and in the anthroposophical system, which is esoteric Christianity, it goes much, much deeper into evil and fallen angels and things like that, so that we can understand this. So you're getting an Ahrimanic class, which is a demon, which is different than the Luciferic class. So Luciferic entities that follow Lucifer, that operate within his horde, operate in a certain kind of way and have their own kind of mythology, their own history with the earth and humanity. Then you have Ahrimanic entities that operate in a different, opposite way than the Luciferic entities operate. It's very important that we understand Ahriman in our era, because those kinds of demonic entities are incredibly intelligent. Luciferic entities are incredibly artistic. Okay, so the Armonic entities, they are obsessed with the science, mathematics, numbers, materialism, and the specific kind of evil that comes through a human when they have a completely self-oriented worldview and then make science and technology their religion. Now, Lucifer is a little bit different. He represents ungrounded spirituality, the worst parts of the New Age, and often sexual deviancy, things like that. So there are different kinds of demonic entities. There's different classes, right? It's not just, we have to understand this because they are evil. And I'm speaking simply here, meaning that they work against Christ, ultimately. But they have their own specific kind of evil. And they work through humanity. So we have to counter the influence of these fallen angels all the time. But they are what the dark occultists work with and are ultimately possessed by. You can't get high up into any sort of dark brotherhood unless you allow these entities to parasitically attach with you, and ultimately unless you merge with technology at some point. Like in Christianity, we become one with the body of Christ because our immortal body is the Christ's body. So we become immortal through him. So we enter into his body, we eateth of his body, right? Now, with Ahriman and with true Satanism, you're entering into his body as an inversion of the Christ, but his body is AI. His body is Neuralink, is transhumanism. So all that transhumanism is techno-Satanism when you have to merge with it, when you have to get a chip in your brain, when you have to have, the satellites beaming 8 million G at you all the time, radiation, when you're living in a tech broligarch's, snow globe, that's the body of Ahriman. That is the inversion of the body of Christ. When we enter into the body of Christ, it's a spiritual event through our own inner work and dedication to him. But this stuff is a false body. It's the body of electricity, of magnetism, of radiation. That's what they worship. That's the 8th sphere as well. That's the body of Satan. And I don't say this to be alarmist. Again, I'm saying this in simple, straightforward terms because we are not prepared for this. And it is shocking to think of it that way because we're being told that all of these things are good, that this is progress. So, dark occultists operate in a very specific way in modern times. And they're going to use classical celestial alignments because they objectively create certain circumstances on the earth. Now, people can be so disconnected from their soul that they don't believe in any of this. That's fine. They do. And it works. People just don't understand why they feel so crappy, right? Why is there a string of shootings all of a sudden in the literal wake of an eclipse? So this is all so important. So a dark occultist can use an eclipse to destabilize society and create chaos to reassert a new order that's really around themselves and their religion, their techno, space colonizing, alien religion. That's why the drones are all happening in the wake of the eclipse as well. Suddenly the drones are back again because they worship their God through technology and they're merging with it, and they want you to do that too, so you can be a resource in their body of God, which is the Ahriman. And the Antichrist is what is feeding in to Ahriman. So, esoterically. So they use these eclipse periods like this weird reset. And people become exhausted, they become tired, they become darkened, they become depressed, they become angry, especially when you take someone and you basically execute them brutally. Most people are not used to seeing that kind of blood and death. That creates a traumatic event. It hurts our heart to see that. If you can watch the Kirk assassination and be happy about that, that's very sick. So anybody dying like that in public is terrible. It's awful. It doesn't matter what political aisle that you fall on. Basic human functioning, basic human heart level existence understands that nobody, no matter your creed, your color, your sexuality, like nobody deserves to be publicly executed while live streaming for having an opinion, for having an idea. Even if it's different than yours. It is completely sick to make t-shirts about it. That's evil to me. It is evil to me to celebrate that. And that's why these things take root. That's why the frustration exists, is because there are people out there who think, well, just because this person had a different idea than me, I'm glad they died in such a horrific way. And, you know, their kids are eventually probably going to have to see that. So humanity is sick. And that's also why this goes on, is because humanity itself is dealing with its own darkness, its own possession. We have to keep that in mind too. It's not just all the dark entities in the spiritual plane that seek to work through humanity parasitically. It's not just the reality that there are organized coalitions of people who are occultists who do these things in the world. That's objectively true. It is also that the masses, that the people, are often no better in character and spiritual orientation than the very people that are performing these black magic operations. And that's a very sad thing to have to come to realize. But it's what I came to realize shortly after the assassination, is that humanity itself has darkness, and it's not just under the thumb of these dark magicians or these spiritual entities, like everybody is good or something. It's like, no, a huge portion of humanity is very, very sick. And that's something that we have to factor in and deal with as well. So again, you get an eclipse, that's a portal. You assassinate someone publicly, the death creates a portal. And what it's like is a magnetic strip. Okay, so when you look at the etheric plane, which is part of the spiritual world, is part of how the spiritual world operates, is the etheric plane. Okay, that's like a magnetic strip. So when you do something that disturbs humanity, like you assassinate a major public figure, the same with Kennedy, people are still so upset about Kennedy's assassination that they meet every year. It's going to happen in about a month and a half. because that evil to them is so offensive, right? When you create a public martyr, when you create a public death, that leaves a mark on the etheric world that is like a bruise. It's like a wound. It weakens humanity when we see these things. When you see murder, you experience evil. All murder is evil. We do not murder. So when this happens, especially in a public way, suddenly you have millions and millions of people who experience the heartbreak and the shock and the terror. And the shock is actually a very big thing. It's not just that it is a repulsive activity to do, it's that when human beings become shocked, we tend to dissociate. So when you get these kind of hardcore political assassinations, it makes people disassociate. It makes them kind of go into a hypnagogic state. It makes them go into a trauma response. That makes them more malleable. And that also patterns the etheric world, because the etheric world is like the memory, it's like a magnetic strip. So now the etheric world is echoing back our own pain to us, like this. And during an eclipse, the veil is thin. So now we've created this echo chamber of shock and trauma and disassociation and anxiety and paranoia and depression and anger. And that's patterning the etheric plane. And now the veil is thinning because of the death. What happens when someone dies? The veil thins and it opens. And then what happens with the two eclipses on either side? It's like a celestial death. So now you've got the thinnest veil you could possibly want. In between two eclipses, you've got a death. And now the etheric plane is patterned with all these chaotic emotions. And for 2 weeks, you get this very powerful, intense, thin veil and the recapitulation of anything that happens during that eclipse period, which is about a 2-week period. We had 2 eclipses. So actually, on the 21st, when the solar eclipse happens, we're still pretty much in the wake of the first one. That's amplifying it. So we're looking at a time where the veil is very thin, and it is to create a reset on the planet. And what my bet is that from now until January 6th especially, but it could go over if they can get enough energy and people can still be so disturbed and disassociated, we will see very powerful grabs for authority in the world. We're already seeing it with the UK. We're going to see it in regards to the Middle East. We have to be very careful that during this time, especially, that we're not getting into any more conflicts in the Middle East. We're going to probably see things potentially amp up in Eastern Europe as well on these fronts, because the dark side wants to carve up the world as they see fit, which involves data centers and power plants and this whole new world, this whole new utopia that they have planned around themselves as royalty. So you have set in motion a perfect occult setup to make huge power moves in the world. And that's what they are going to do. They want to make tyrannical moves. They want to create war. They want to create more death. I wouldn't be surprised if there were more shootings, more assassination attempts. Because once you get it kicked off, you have to maintain the chaos that you've created. And then you have also, again, you had these shootings. I'll cover the shootings a little bit at the very end. But that's food for the entities you summon. You summon the entities. You summon the egregore, the fallen angels, the demonic entities. You summon them through the eclipse, through death, through blood hitting the soil, blood in the soil. The most powerful way to do a sacrifice, public sacrifice for the dark occult. Now you've got all these entities walking around that probably shouldn't be here if God's order was in place. Now you've got to feed them. Now they're hungry. You got to feed the egregores with fear and trauma, disassociation. So you have shootings right after. You have turmoil. You have all kinds of politics that are designed to make you mad. Well, guess what? Those demonic entities are eating that up and getting even more powerful. Because that's how this works. We solve this through Stoicism. We solve these occult problems, again, through Stoicism. You can get mad. You can get sad. You can experience whatever you want to feel. But you've got to bring it back to the center, because the only thing that's going to cut through all of this crap is a methodical, deep, Christ-centered approach to this corruption. And this dark occult activity will not be solved overnight. But if you can have a methodical, stoic approach where at every angle it is confronted through God, that is how we begin to cut it back. That's what works. Anything done through this like intense feelings of paranoia or outrage, even righteous anger, is still anger. You've got to bring it to clarity, and you've got to bring it to a solid, stoic, righteous, loving place, because that's what doesn't feed the demonic entities. If we don't feed the demonic entities that are summoned, the people in power lose power. They lose influence, especially over the masses that are totally operating unconsciously. Don't feed the dark entities, the dark occult orders that use them lose power. That's how we win. It's inner peace. It's Christ-centeredness. It is a methodical precision towards the good and the true and love that pushes this back, and it becomes more and more and more compounded as we go. We also must understand what's going on a spiritual level, because we are affected by it, and especially unconscious. The unconscious are the most affected by it. And it is our duty, when you become aware, to protect the unaware. That is the duty of the aware. So, like any celestial event, eclipses can be used positively or negatively. We can productively harness the force of an eclipse by doing inner work, by facing our shadow, by facing our trauma. Low emotion, dark memories, and even lower entities may manifest around you and affect you whenever there's an eclipse season. And this is, I have an online community, and I talk about this stuff, with my members all the time. And whenever there's an eclipse season, the forum always explodes with people that have bad dreams, psychic attacks, all their trauma comes up. It's like clockwork. So when you go through an eclipse, just know that you're going to be going through probably maybe a little bit of a difficult time. Plan forward and go inward. That's how you use the magic of the eclipse to actually grow yourself as you're meant to. It's a useful time. It's a neutral event, actually, that can be harnessed negatively or positively. And the positive way is to use it for self-growth and to confront your shadow, to purify yourself. During the eclipses, it's a good time to rest, to purify, become really embodied. It's not a good time to take on any big projects or big engagements. High stress things are not advised during an eclipse. It's really a time where you could have low energy, you could have brain fog, you could feel attacked, you could just feel attacked for some reason. And so just keep that in mind for the future. On the side of ceremonial magic and dark occult practice, a dark practitioner can use eclipses to manifest chaos and darkness on the earth. They can augment it, they can bring it forward. And so anytime there's an eclipse, solar forces or the Christ forces, the Christ himself is obscured, which allows these demonic entities to affect humanity much more than under normal circumstances. And people also more inwardly are susceptible to confusion, high emotion, and fear. So, okay, now I want to close our talk today with some historical examples of eclipses and how they were always a time period of concern. So, here is King Lear, and this is of course Shakespeare, and King Lear discusses how during an eclipse there's often societal breakdown. Like you can just track it, like if there's an eclipse, then suddenly there is this political turmoil, ruin, and society starts breaking down, and it's like people kind of are not their best selves. So I'm going to read that to you. This is Act 1, Scene 2, and Gloucester says, "These late eclipses in the sun and moon portend no good to us. Though the wisdom of nature can reason it thus and thus, yet nature finds itself scourged by the sequent effects. Yet nature finds itself scourged by the sequent effects. Love cools, friendship falls off, brothers divide, in cities mutinies, in countries discord, in places treason, and the bond cracked twixt son and father." So even in Shakespeare's King Lear, we're seeing how eclipses are times of turmoil, times where brother turns against brother, friends fight, treason, and mutinies. And this actually was written about an actual eclipse that happened in 1605. And people felt like this eclipse was particularly bad because it aligned with a bunch of things. And so Shakespeare had written about it in King Lear. To get very technical about eclipse, you're not just dealing with moon. Moon is part of what is called the Black Sun Corridor, or the night side corridor, or the dark corridor. So when you're dealing with the demonic plane, when you're dealing with the world of death, when you're dealing with this kind of underworld occultism, you're really dealing with three planetary bodies representing the three prior developments of man. So it's moon, black sun, or Sol Negredo, and Saturn. These are all part of what is called the corridor of death, or I think you could probably also call it perdition. And in esoterica, during an eclipse, what's really opening up is not just like the underworld. The underworld is really revealed as three planetary bodies in their most dark existence. It's representing moon, the dark side of the moon, and then black sun, and then Saturn. So it goes Saturn, black sun, moon. So really you're looking at a false trinity, a kind of Saturn, dark father, black sun, a kind of antichrist, and then you're looking at this lunar dark Holy Spirit kind of energy. So really in occultism it's viewed as a direct inversion of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, which is represented by light and the sun and creation, and then you're getting and life, and then you're getting death, which includes Saturn, the fallen father, which is often associated with Sorat, and then you're getting black sun. Okay, now you're getting into Nazi esoterica, yes, yes, and then you're getting into black moon. So you're looking at really a false trinity that is using the dark side of those three spheres, which represent to us at this point in time something about our death process and something about the underworld. I'm not saying Saturn is evil. I'm not even saying black sun is evil. I'm not saying that moon is evil. I'm saying that in the cosmology of death, the dark side of those spheres, or for the uninitiated, those spheres represent absolute fragmentation and destruction. It is the abyss. So there was also, I also found this really interesting, is that in 1652, there was this pamphlet that was passed out in London, and what it was you had this sort of group that was individualists and that were moving towards natural science and trying to get people away from superstition, trying to get people away from these different folk beliefs they had, because the issues that people were running into in that early modern period was that people were completely controlled by this sort of more pagan spirituality and these folk beliefs, to the point that they didn't believe that they had any power or agency over their life. So what would happen is that an eclipse would occur and people would lose control of their mind, lose control of their body. They would go mad. They would use eclipses as an excuse to do bad things. And, if their neighbor looked at them the wrong way and then their cow got sick, that person was a witch. And people didn't really believe they had full agency over their consciousness and over themselves as an individuality. And so there were spiritual movements that were bringing forward the reality that you're not just subject, like an unconscious thing, to all of these natural forces around you. You have agency, you have will. And then on the extreme end of it, on the more and more extreme end of it, this intense individuality was separating from its original source, which was Christ. Christ is a spiritual being that brings forward everybody's individuality. We don't even understand individuality until we encounter the Christ in the world. And now you had another group that was orienting themselves around natural science. And they were saying, none of it is true. No, the spirit, we don't even know if the spiritual world even exists. You're silly, you're ridiculous. And we're falling into a whole new cult, which is the cult of science, the cult of natural science, which has focused its energy downward in this harmonic way into the material world that denies the spiritual reality, but is then projecting its desire for spirituality and answers and connection with God into the material world and seeking to rule it as a God. Because even though you don't believe in God, you still seek to have a feeling of God. You just make yourself God, or the government God, right? Or whatever. We can't escape our makeup. We seek God, we crave God because that is also our completion. So they try to do this through this weird, sick way, which is why now you have like trust the science. It's the same kind of weird religion we had thousands of years ago, where you had to believe in this or that. You have to believe in the science. Well, this started during that period too, and there were these pamphlets that were going around that were saying, you shouldn't. Don't lose your mind during the eclipse because you have agency and things like that. So I'll link the actual pamphlet, the actual writing from the pamphlet below in the description. But one of the phrases was, "Why gaze ye brain-sick people on the sky to seek in heaven some uncouth prodigy?" So very Shakespearean. I really don't understand what that means. But you had these sort of these scientific-minded aristocrats that were calling out these magicians and superstitious people for fearing the eclipse and for feeling as though the eclipse was controlling them. And so there was this entire movement around that time that was trying to move people away from being so affected by celestial events. And just the idea that there could be a dark occultist controlling them. Like, we were very afraid of that. And so that's interesting to look at now, because I think we've gone obviously in the complete other direction, where we need to pay more attention to the spiritual world and begin to kind of disentangle ourselves from looking for spiritual answers in matter, in the material world. We need to spiritualize again. The last interesting eclipse that I wanted to talk about today was May 12th, 1706. And this was during the time of King Louis XIV of France. And he was known as the Sun King. And so his astrologers let him know that there's going to be this eclipse coming. And they felt like, actually pretty much any astrologer or spiritual advisor would become very concerned about leadership. They'd become particularly concerned about kings or any kind of leader during an eclipse. Because it is the case that to create turmoil and to create the ultimate amount of chaos, to fulfill their desire for reset and power shifts around the world or whatever, you want to sort of potentially focus on a leader. You want to do, that's where you're going to get the most bang for your buck. You're not going to focus your dark eclipse power from your dark rites onto some like person you don't even know. If your goal is to control the world, you're going to try to focus the powers of death and chaos onto someone who threatens you, or who you feel that if you remove, you can gain the upper hand. So it's a very precise chaos in that way. So, of course, his court astrologers were very concerned about this eclipse. We think that it could lead to you being overthrown. And so generally what they would do with different royal members, like royalty, or they probably would do it with political leaders too, is during the eclipses, you want to hide them. You want to tuck them away. You don't want them to be out exposed to different things at all. And that's what they used to do a lot of the times with early kings, chiefs, whatever, is you don't want your best guys, powerful people out there, during one of the most malefic periods celestially. And so we're going to get into that on our next episode, where I talk about the rituals I think would be most likely during an eclipse to bring about a kind of reset. So I'll stop the conversation there with Louis XIV, but let's close out this last section. So, no matter the culture, eclipses of both the sun and moon were viewed as times of disintegration and turmoil. People feared that dark magicians could harness the power of an eclipse to dethrone political leaders and assert a new order. The obscuration of the sun was a direct spiritual environment in which that could happen, as demonic entities would naturally be more reachable for these dark magicians. And don't forget that, well, actually, I don't want to go too deeply into the next episode, so I'll just do that next week. Okay. If we lived even a few hundred years ago, the main conversation we would be having would no doubt be concern over whether the Kirk assassination was connected with the eclipses and dark occultism using the eclipses. If this was even 300-400 years ago, we wouldn't be able to stop talking about the dark occult elements of this public figure's death. It's funny how far we've come. Yeah, if this were to happen hundreds of years ago, the main conversation would no doubt be concern over whether or not the Kirk assassination was part of a dark occult rite for an opposing group to take power. Today, we don't think the spiritual world exists, or we don't understand it, and we become superstitious about it. So let's just take one last look here of the assassination celestially. Okay, so here it is. On the 7th, on September 7th, you have a total lunar eclipse. Portal opens. On the 10th of September, you have the brutal public assassination of Kirk, which is a blood sacrifice. On the 22nd, 11 days later, you have a partial solar eclipse. The portal is intensified and opens again to a higher magnitude. And then 7 days later, you have the Grand Blanc shooting of the Mormon church in Michigan. On the 28th, the same day, you have a casino shooting in Texas. On the 27th, you have a Southport shooting off the Cape Fear. And I mean, all of these are heavily publicized. We have shootings in America, and sometimes they never get publicized. These shootings became heavily, heavily publicized, and you have to be able to pay attention also to what makes it into the algorithm and what doesn't. If you think that we live in a society where the algorithm is natural and true, and that there isn't programmers back there creating a propaganda engine on X, a propaganda engine on Facebook, a propaganda engine on Instagram. Yes, there's different factions that are warring with each other to be the biggest tech bro of all. That's absolutely happening. And yes, at least X, people are happier with X because it's less censored, apparently. I don't believe that to be true, actually. I think that X is plenty censored, right? It's like we're just loving the crumbs right now because we're in such peril with these tech bros. And their ominous, threatening way of just bringing in a whole new way of life for us, of high surveillance techno-occultism. Anyway, so on the 27th, we have this Southport Cape Fear shooting, and it is bizarre because I believe it's that particular shooting where this guy is like, the shooter is this radicalized guy from the military, and he's like holding a picture of like it's like a skull, a crystal skull, like the Mitchell Hedges skull, or like one of the crystal skulls from South America, from the, Mayan kingdom. So you're telling me that we literally had two black sun events, also known as eclipses, heading into the dark days of the year, the time in which the black sun rages, in which it is the most prominent, in which the death phase, all the plants die, the world goes into sleep. That's a death phase for the earth, which is represented by the Negretto black sun. You're literally telling me that then we have this symbol of death, the skull, held up to a radicalized, probably MK Ultra military guy who goes and shoots people, literally holding the symbol of the black sun, literally holding the symbol of death during eclipses, which are the time of death, the time where the underworld of death roams the earth. This is what we're dealing with. The esoteric side of Nazism that had skulls on their uniform. The esoteric Nazism that worships black sun. This is blatant. This is obvious. To have a skull during an eclipse is to wear a Christmas hat during Christmas. It's to have the Easter bunny at the mall on Easter Sunday. We'll get into that next time. We'll get into the guy with the skull and the Brotherhood of Death next week, and the rituals that I think could be performed in this particular period specifically. So by looking at that timeline, we can tell that there were dual eclipses. There's not one but two eclipses. Incredibly impactful time. But let's close on this. Your energy is feeding it or starving it. We must come to understand that there is a spiritual level of warfare that is happening, and that spiritual level is fed by our thoughts and emotions. The first thing we learn to understand in esoterica is that your thoughts are things in the spiritual world. Your feelings are things in the spiritual world, in the astral world. The thoughts that you create, the feelings that you feel, are going to feed the chaos or starve it. We can get ourselves to a point where they can do as much creepy, weird stuff during the eclipse as they want, and they will. But it does not have the effect over humanity that it could. There's very little substrate for these demonic entities that come into the world through these sick things. There's not enough for them to eat. And so they fade away. We can have this be at a 0 or 1 or 2, or it can be a 50 based on how we act. We can't prevent these psychotic weirdos from doing their black magic stuff. We can control our response. We can become educated in spiritual science, which is not paganism, which is not New Age. It is objectively understanding the spiritual world because we're operating in it. And it's also not anti-Christian. It's not anti any religion. It is the objective esoteric reality of all spiritual life and brings deeper understanding to any kind of spiritual figure. including yourself, including your own initiation. Your stoicism, your dedication to peace and God starves these kinds of events. And your knowledge of celestial forces and esoteric science prevents these things from taking control of society. Eclipses are a time when dark forces have access to the earth and humanity, bringing forward intense fear, paranoia, and deep traumas that are within the subconscious mind. So the other thing I wanted to make clear with eclipse before I go is because we're dealing with this lunar force, what comes up for the world is not just your own inner trauma, though that does come up. What eclipses bring about is actually the recapitulation of deep cultural traumas, deep traumas within different cultures, within different larger groups, which is also why it is a precise kind of chaos magic to blame every single group you can imagine did the assassination. It's because eclipses bring up the global wounds, the wounds of every group soul, the wounds of every culture as a collective, the earth as a collective, not just use an individual, but our collective wounds. That comes up. So of course you're going to use an assassination, and you're also going to make, the straights mad at the gays, mad at transgender people. You're going to make, ideally the right mad at the left. Before that, it's race war, black against white. Again, as I said in the last video, we've got a lot of healing to do between different groups in this world, but we will do that on our terms through meaningful discussion with a higher purpose and higher orientation. We will not heal through cruelty. We will not heal through all of this dark stuff that's going on. It's just making our wounds worse. And that's exactly what chaos magic does in regards to group souls, or what sometimes in esoteric science is called the racial souls or the cultural souls. Because everybody, you have your own individuality, right? With your own history, your own soul history. And then you also have your family and ancestral history and wounds and talents and everything. And then you have groups, larger groups, cultures that have their own talents, their own gifts, and their own shadow self too. So all the shadows come forward, not just your personal shadow, but group shadows come forward as well, and they war with each other. And so we have to understand, that's what causes the decline. We need to come together and discuss these things in a practical and meaningful way. I know that's going to be difficult, if not impossible right now, but that needs to be the goal. Otherwise, we're literally just playing into this dark occult stuff. And occultism is your mind. The world of the occult is your mind. It is your thoughts. That's why every monk learns meditation. It doesn't matter what you call it, East or West. The first thing a monk does is learn to control their mind. It's meditation, it's silence, it's isolation. Because the spiritual world works through the mind. It works through your emotions. I talk about this in my last class a couple weeks ago as well. Psychic business. The spiritual world works through you. So we have to be able to have some agency over our thoughts and our emotions if we don't want to just get ushered down into one chaos ritual after another, after another, after another, and completely lose ourselves and everything we believe in. Dark occult group can easily use this double eclipse period to destabilize the world through back-to-back traumatic events. And occultists can augment chaos through creating tragic events and attempt to prolong it and eventually get people to accept a new order and laws they wouldn't normally accept. So again, with the magnetic strip idea, let's close with this. You can have these portals open, which are eclipses. And if you can drum up enough trauma, you can actually extend esoterically the length of the eclipse, and you can feed the entities you've summoned through the eclipse. Eclipse is the veil is thin, gate opens, dark entities come in through blood, through sacrifice. Entities are here. You create so much trauma and turmoil and confusion and chaos. You feed the entities. The entities are eating the pain. They're eating the depression. They're eating. You're in shock. You're in trauma. You're angry. They're eating it. You're prolonging their existence in this realm by all of these low emotions and chaos that you're feeling. You're feeding the entities. You're feeding the egregores. That's what they eat. They eat your thoughts. They eat your emotion. They draw closer to you. They draw closer to the world. The world becomes darker. So they prolong the activity of an eclipse for months, even years, by being able to feed the entities that they summon through the death, an eclipse period of a public figure. You feed them, we feed them. So that period is extended for a longer time than natural because first it was a celestial event. First it's just the opening and closing of doors. That's all it is. Then that's harnessed and augmented by dark magicians with the power and influence to do that. You participate in a sick sacrifice ritual, potentially, allegedly. You see blood, it hits the soil. Someone dies and is martyred. The entities feed on the reaction. They feed on us. That extends the period of influence in which they are able to affect us because now it's our fault. At first, it's a celestial event, whatever, the gates are opening and closing. So what? Some dark occultists did some ritual. But now it's on us, it's on me, and it's on you. Now it's on us. How are we going to react? How are you going to react? Are we going to continue feeding the darkness in this world? Or will we go inward to Christ in our heart and feed them nothing and get this ship turned around in the direction of God in every single one of our hearts? This is our calling right now. We need to come together and focus on this because what we are fighting is inhuman. It is not of this world. It uses this world and the people in it for its own desires. This is how we have to think of it. That is how we win on the spiritual level. Thank you guys so much for joining me. I will be right back here next week and we will discuss, as I mentioned, the type of rituals. I mentioned 2 specific rituals I think would be good candidates for what has happened 2 weeks ago. And I'll also, if I have time, get into the dark days of the year and specifics about the dark occult brotherhood that I believe could be behind this. But that may be another week as well. So you guys, thank you so much. Thank you for your support. If you do enjoy my work, consider making a donation so I can continue making this free content for you. I take no sponsors. I am completely supported by viewers like you. So if you like this work, please consider joining my premium platform. I have an archive of like hundreds of hours of live Q&As where I answer your questions about stuff just like this. I have a free class on the four bodies for members that lets you understand the physical body, the astral body, the etheric body, and the Christ. And I just released a course a few weeks ago as well that allows me to keep doing all this free stuff. Sign up for my announcements letter to know when I'm going to go live again. And as always, all my love your way. And I'll see you very soon.